In the harsh winter of 1745, something horrifying unfolded in New York's Mohawk Valley. An event so brutal that colonial authorities buried it for nearly 3 centuries. 17 families, 43 men, women, and children were slaughtered in raids too precise to be random. Survivors whispered of a hidden hand orchestrating the terror. What they didn't know was that the mastermind was just 11 years old. Fluent in 3 languages and raised in the heart of colonial warfare, Jonas Creighton had already turned mass murder into a business. His name appears only 3 times in colonial records from that winter, each stamped with a mysterious seal historians only recently deciphered, sealed by gubernatorial order. But this story didn't emerge from old archives. It came from the deathbed confession of a Mohawk elder in 1823, recorded by a missionary who locked the truth away for generations. In 1745, the Mohawk Valley was a volatile frontier of Dutch settlers, German immigrants, Scots, Irish frontiersmen, and English merchants, all trapped in the bloody chess match of King George's War. Fort Hunter served as the region's main trading post, a wooden compound behind 12-foot palisades. There lived Hamish Creighton, a cunning arms dealer from Glasgow, who had turned chaos into fortune. His household was a tangle of cultural allegiances: Mohawk interpreters, a French defector, and a Virginian bookkeeper. After his wife's death in childbirth, Hamish raised his only son amid musket fire, tense negotiations, and the constant buzz of war. Jonas Creighton was no ordinary boy. By 7, he spoke English, Dutch, and Mohawk. He had a cold intelligence, a quiet presence, and a gift for reading people. He moved through the world, like an observer, absorbing everything. In early 1745, troubling news reached the valley. French forces under Captain Paul Marouin were moving south, backed by well-armed Abenaki and Huron war parties. Even more disturbing, the weapons they carried looked like the custom muskets from Hamish Creighton's inventory. In May, Captain Edmund Stockwell of the New York militia visited Fort Hunter. He warned Hamish that someone was selling weapons to both sides, arming colonists and their enemies alike. It was treason, and worse, it was dooming innocent settlers. On the morning of June 14th, Jonas sat in his father's study, meticulously copying inventory logs as 2 Mohawk warriors approached. One was Karanati, the brother of their interpreter then, the other a younger man named Konwatiti. They came with a message the French needed more of the special muskets, the ones with silver bands around the stock. Outside, Huron warriors waited in the tree line. Jonas felt no fear. He felt anticipation. He saw what others didn't. This wasn't just trade, it was power. Information, not gunpowder, won wars. Whispers in the right ears could shift the fate of nations. Hamish agreed to the delivery, but raised the price, citing increased British patrols. After the Mohawk men left, Jonas carefully approached his father. With feigned innocence, he asked what might happen if the British learned about the silver-banded muskets. Would they want to know where they came from? Would they pay for that information? The seed was planted. Within days, Hamish reached out to British intelligence, offering to act as a double agent. What he didn't know was that Jonas had already begun sending letters written in perfect English, Dutch, and Mohawk to commanders, traders, and tribal leaders across the region. His first independent move came after overhearing 2 Dutch traders talk about the Vanderburg farm, a prosperous estate on the river, run by Peter Vanderburg since 1739. Jonas had found his first pawn, and the game had just begun. Greer Vanderburg was known throughout the Mohawk Valley for her herbal remedies, often bartering them for goods her family couldn't produce. The Vanderburgs were everything Jonas Creighton needed: wealthy enough to matter, isolated enough to fall quietly, and most importantly, recently aligned with French agents, bypassing Hamish Creighton's trade network and cutting into family profits by nearly 15%. On June 28th, Jonas arrived at the Vanderburg farm under the pretense of delivering a message from his father, requesting medicine for a sick trader. While Greer prepared willow bark tea, Jonas casually engaged Peter in conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions about French activity. With practiced innocence, he mentioned the French captain who bought muskets from his father, claiming the man had said some Dutch farmers were helping French soldiers hide from the British. He added with childlike guilt that he wasn't supposed to hear, but thought the captain mentioned Dutch families near the river. Jonas's words struck their target. Peter, concerned and unable to verify anything, was left with a seed of doubt and fear. 3 days later, he appeared at Fort Hunter, requesting a meeting with British representatives to affirm his family's loyalty. That meeting, brokered through Jonas Creighton's contacts, placed the Vanderburgs squarely on British intelligence watch lists, exactly where Jonas intended. What followed displayed a level of strategic manipulation worthy of seasoned intelligence operatives. Jonas, through his network of tribal contacts, learned that a small Huron war party was planning raids on farms, suspected of aiding British forces. These were to be warnings, not massacres, meant to deter, not destroy. But Jonas had other plans. On July 8th, he visited the Huron camp, and speaking fluent Mohawk, claimed to have overheard British scouts discussing the Vanderburg farm as a hub for British officers and colonial militias. He fabricated a story the family was providing intelligence that had already led to French losses. He offered precise details about the farm's layout, the family's routines, and even claimed British officers would be meeting there on July 12th. None of it was true, but it was exactly the kind of story the Hurons were ready to believe. Meanwhile, Jonas fed the British side similar disinformation. Through Hamish's channels, he passed along reports of French coercion against Dutch settlers and produced a forged letter, supposedly intercepted from French agents, naming the Vanderburg farm as a staging ground for attacks. Written in flawless French, the letter was convincing enough to spark British suspicion and action. On the morning of July 12th, a British patrol led by Sergeant Timothy Hewlett approached the Vanderburg property. At the same time, 12 Huron warriors surrounded the farm, expecting to strike a coordinated British outpost. What followed was a catastrophic misunderstanding. Peter Vanderburg was killed defending his family from unknown attackers. Greer died trying to reach her children hiding in the root cellar. When the British patrol arrived and saw the Huron war party, a firefight erupted, killing 5 soldiers and 7 warriors. In under an hour, the Vanderburg farm was destroyed. An entire family was erased, and nearly a dozen others died, all because an 11-year-old boy told exactly the right lies to precisely the right people. Jonas watched the aftermath like a scientist observing the results of an experiment. He had learned how timing, misinformation, and emotional manipulation could turn fear into chaos. Each faction had heard what it feared most. Peter worried about French influence, believed his neighbors were disloyal. The Hurons, angry over British interference, believed the Dutch were collaborators. British officers suspicious of Dutch settlements accepted a forged letter as truth. Their fears did the rest. The massacre achieved everything Jonas had intended. In the week following the attack, Jonas Creighton sold 37 muskets to panicked Dutch farmers, 24 pistols to nervous British officers, and barrels of gunpowder to French agents preparing for retaliation. The death of one family had ignited a wildfire of paranoia, fueling arms sales across every side of the conflict. Jonas recorded every transaction in his private journal with the same precision he brought to his father's official inventory lists. But these pages contained far more than quantities and prices. They held calculations that linked profits to body counts, insights into the psychological weaknesses of various groups, and notes on the ideal moments to inject false intelligence into volatile political situations. By mid-July, Jonas Creighton was no longer just an exceptionally bright child. He had become a master manipulator who understood that lies, if timed well, could kill more efficiently than any musket his father sold. By late June, Jonas stood at the center of an invisible communication web stretching from the Hudson River to Lake Ontario. Leveraging his father's trading network and his own linguistic fluency, he began coordinating a wave of miscommunications, each one designed to turn minor incidents into full-scale catastrophes. His strategy was brutally effective selective truth-telling. He filtered scout reports to exaggerate French troop movements, withheld warnings from vulnerable settlers, and distorted battlefield intelligence with surgical precision. His first real test came on July 2nd. A Huron messenger informed him of a planned raid on the Henderson Farm, a small undefended homestead 15 miles north of Fort Hunter. The family, Thomas and Sarah Henderson, and their 3 young children, were ideal targets. Their deaths, Jonas knew, would spark outrage and weapon sales. But rather than let the family be wiped out, he added a twist. 3 days before the attack, Jonas sent a vague warning through a Dutch trader, hinting that French agents had been seen nearby and suggesting a trip to Albany might be wise. It was phrased as casual advice, not a direct alert. Predictably, Thomas Henderson, a proud Scots-Irish veteran of earlier conflicts, refused to flee. Instead, he summoned neighbors and formed a small militia. By July 5th, a dozen armed men stood ready at his farm. The next morning, Jonas visited the Huron camp and relayed what he claimed to have overheard from British scouts. The farm was defended only by old men and boys, with regular militia pulled back to protect Albany. He assured the war party that the muskets they'd purchased would end the skirmish quickly. The resulting battle lasted 3 hours. Thomas Henderson and 2 of his children were killed along with 7 other colonists. 5 Huron warriors died, including the leader who had trusted Jonas's intel. Survivors on both sides left with conflicting stories that made no sense, but fueled fear and confusion. Within days, Hamish Creighton had sold 47 muskets to newly formed militias, 62 pounds of gunpowder to French agents, and a shipment of pistols to Mohawk warriors bent on revenge. And Jonas, seated quietly in his father's study, logged every detail. Profits measured not just in coins, but corpses. By August, Jonas had moved beyond tactical manipulation. He now saw the region's entire commercial system stretching from Montreal to Albany as a battlefield. French agents, British officials, tribal emissaries, and rival traders were all unwitting pieces in his expanding game. Through observation and strategic conversation, Jonas mapped this web with the precision of a military cartographer. He identified vulnerabilities. Isaac Clark, a German Lutheran merchant near Nose's settlement, was financially flailing due to French military disruptions. Abraham Yates, a Dutch supplier in Schenectady, was looking for new British Army contracts. Samuel Wells, an English trader in Albany, was sniffing around French arms deals, possibly on orders from British intelligence. Each man represented both opportunity and threat. Jonas understood that controlling the flow of information between them could tilt the balance of power in the regional arms trade. His first target, Isaac Clark. Religious suspicion made Clark wary of French Catholics, while financial stress made him desperate. Jonas learned through Mohawk contacts that French agents had approached Clark about storing weapons. Clark had reluctantly agreed. Jonas saw his chance. Through Hamish's British intelligence contacts, he passed along modified intel, portraying Clark as a willing collaborator with the French. Simultaneously, he fed information to French agents, suggesting that Clark planned to betray them to the British in exchange for protection. The brilliance lay in the fact that both stories were partly true, but stripped of context, each side believed only what they feared most. The end came on August 23rd before dawn. Acting on what they thought was ironclad intelligence colonial militia, raided Clark's trading post. Inside, they found French weapons exactly as Jonas had promised. The operation was swift and brutal. Clark's business was destroyed, his name smeared and his market share evaporated, soon absorbed into Hamish Creighton's expanding empire. Inside Isaac Clark's ruined trading post, colonial militia found a cache of muskets and gunpowder that Clark couldn't explain without revealing his dealings with French agents, confirmation of treason that sealed his fate. But before Clark could be formally arrested, a Huron war party launched a surprise attack on the militia patrol, claiming the weapons had been stolen by a traitorous German merchant. The resulting firefight killed 6 colonial soldiers, 4 Huron warriors, and left Clark himself fatally wounded in the crossfire. Within a month, Hamish Creighton absorbed Clark's trade routes and clientele, expanding his reach into German settlements that had once been inaccessible. With competition eliminated, the Creightons raised prices and reduced service quality, knowing terrified settlers had few alternatives in an increasingly violent frontier. Jonas's next operation focused on disrupting the supply chain between remote trading posts and major hubs like Albany and New York City. He'd learned that shipments of weapons and supplies moved along predictable routes, vulnerable to ambushes that could be disguised as random acts of war, but carefully timed to serve calculated commercial goals. Samuel Wells, the Albany-based merchant who had been probing too deeply into French arms purchases, presented both a risk to the Creighton family and a chance for Jonas to demonstrate his control over regional military events. Quiet investigation confirmed Jonas's suspicions. Wells was working with British intelligence gathering data on French supply lines for future raids. But instead of eliminating him outright, Jonas devised a more intricate solution, one that would destroy French resources, remove Wells as a threat, and simultaneously stimulate demand for new weapon shipments. Using his tribal connections, Jonas fed French agents real intelligence about British convoys traveling between Albany and the frontier. The data was precise enough to guarantee successful ambushes, but altered just enough to ensure chaos. He told French commanders that the convoys were lightly defended and filled with commercial goods, encouraging aggressive attacks with high expectations. What he omitted was that these convoys were transporting British intelligence operatives, including Samuel Wells, en route to meetings with colonial agents. On September 14th, French forces intercepted the convoy as planned. Instead of finding soft targets, they ran into a military escort guarding high-value intelligence officers. The ensuing battle lasted 4 hours, leaving the convoy destroyed, nearly the entire French raiding party wiped out, and Wells among the dead, along with 2 other British agents who had posed long-term risks to Jonas's operations. The cost to both sides was high, but for Jonas, the outcome was perfect. Both the British and French needed to replace lost weapons and supplies, and the Creighton trading post stood ready to meet the sudden surge in demand. But Jonas's most ambitious plan during this period targeted the fragile alliance between British colonial authorities and their Oneida allies. While the Oneida had remained loyal, providing scouts and warriors in the war against France, they had also resisted repeated French recruitment attempts. Jonas saw in this loyalty both a cornerstone of British strength and a pressure point ripe for exploitation. If the Oneida could be made to believe that the British were planning to betray them, it would destabilize the alliance, open the door for French advances, and trigger a new wave of arms sales to panicked colonial settlers. The plan began with patient study. Through his Mohawk contacts, Jonas identified key figures in the Oneida political structure, especially Shenandoah, a respected war chief, known for his quiet concerns about British intentions toward tribal lands. These concerns gave Jonas the leverage he needed. From British intelligence channels, Jonas learned of a planned military operation targeting French positions near Lake Ontario. The plan involved temporary British outposts to support the campaign. But Jonas spun it differently. Through casual conversations with Oneida representatives, he suggested the posts might not be temporary at all. Perhaps he mused innocently the British intended to make these bases permanent to control Oneida movements and limit their access to traditional hunting grounds. His questions were framed as the naive curiosity of a child, but they carried a dark subtext designed to sow doubt and fear. Meanwhile, he delivered altered intelligence to the British, claiming that the French had successfully recruited Oneida warriors to strike colonial settlements. This wasn't entirely false. French agents had approached the Oneida, but Jonas exaggerated their success and downplayed tribal resistance, ensuring the British would overreact. The inevitable confrontation came on October 3rd during a tense meeting between British officers and Oneida leaders. Acting on Jonas's false reports, Captain Edmund Stockwell entered the discussion with suspicion and accusations, demanding public demonstrations of Oneida loyalty. The damage had already been done. Shenandoah, already unsettled by Jonas's subtle suggestions about British expansion, interpreted Captain Stockwell's demands as confirmation of betrayal. The resulting collapse in negotiations had immediate and disastrous consequences. Oneida warriors once committed to aiding British operations against French positions withdrew from the campaign, leaving colonial forces dangerously exposed. Worse still, the diplomatic breakdown emboldened French agents, who intensified recruitment among other tribes, creating new threats the British were ill-prepared to face. Jonas observed the unfolding crisis with a fascination that bordered on scientific detachment. He had successfully sown mistrust between powerful factions with nothing more than well-timed questions and carefully manipulated truths. The fallout: military failures, tribal defections, and panicked arms deals only further cemented the Creighton family's commercial dominance. Yet Jonas's greatest success wasn't measured in sales or strategic outcomes. It was the quiet, unnoticed invention of modern information warfare centuries ahead of its time. As summer gave way to autumn, Jonas refined his techniques. He no longer relied on lies alone. Instead, he mastered the art of delivering accurate information at the worst possible time. A real French troop movement, reported to the British one day too late, could lead to an ambush. A true detail about British convoys fed to the right tribe could trigger raids with devastating consequences. His most innovative tactic was something he called the echo method. He would engineer or intercept a single piece of intelligence, then subtly distort it as it moved through his network. By the time it reached its destination, it was almost unrecognizable. Yet every alteration served Jonas's goal: inflaming conflict, boosting demand for weapons, and eliminating potential threats to the family's empire. On September 18th, Jonas learned that Captain Stockwell was planning a major offensive near Lake George, involving coordination with Oneida warriors and efforts to prevent Mohawk forces from aligning with the French. It was a perfect opportunity for sabotage. Jonas started with Tequita, a trusted Mohawk interpreter and childhood friend. He shared what sounded like a personal concern that British plans included permanent forts on sacred Mohawk hunting lands. The information was real, but framed as an immediate threat. Tequita passed the warning to her uncle Chief Canon Warohara, who began organizing Mohawk resistance against the British resistance Stockwell wasn't expecting. At the same time, Jonas planted seeds of paranoia among the British. Through his father's intelligence contacts, he leaked that French forces had detailed knowledge of British troop movements, implying a traitor in their ranks. Technically true, since Jonas himself was feeding the French. But the resulting suspicion disrupted British coordination and morale. The battle at Lake George became a disaster. Oneida warriors never arrived. Unexpected Mohawk resistance shattered British formations. 37 colonial soldiers died in a futile, bloody engagement. French losses were heavy too. But for Jonas, it was a masterpiece. With both sides reeling, arms sales surged. Jonas Creighton moved record volumes of muskets, gunpowder, and provisions. French intermediaries, colonial officers, and tribal leaders all bought desperately, each believing they were preparing for a future Jonas had secretly designed. Death had become a revenue stream, and disaster the most valuable currency in the Mohawk Valley. As frost crept across the valley in October, new intelligence reached Jonas that offered a chance for his most devastating operation yet. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel's French convoy wasn't just another target, it was a perfect storm of timing, resources, and opportunity. The convoy carried not only winter supplies, but a substantial payroll destined for French forces across the region, as well as specialized weapons for seasonal operations. Jonas understood that its destruction could cripple French logistics and ignite conflicts across tribal and colonial lines. But to make it happen, he needed to manipulate three separate military powers into converging on one location, Deer Creek. He began with the British. Captain Stockwell, desperate to prove himself after repeated setbacks, was especially vulnerable to reports of high-value French targets. Jonas crafted a series of intelligence briefings delivered through his father's contacts. The first, sent in mid-October, hinted that the French were preparing major offensives and moving resources through the area. The second, timed with increased French activity, claimed the convoy was lightly defended and carried a massive payroll. Crucially, the reports omitted details about the convoy's escort strength and mischaracterized its mission to make it appear both vulnerable and dangerous. British commanders, under pressure and misinformed, began mobilizing. Next, Jonas turned to the tribal groups. Each faction required a tailored deception. To Karanhiaktati's Mohawk war party, he described the convoy as a peaceful trading expedition, delivering supplies, promised for tribal families, turning a military operation into a humanitarian mission. His phrasing emphasized food tools and goods while minimizing weapons and payroll details. To other tribes, Jonas sold a different version. Huron warriors were told that British militias were preparing to intercept French gifts meant for tribal communities. Abnaki scouts heard that British forces planned to attack neutral traders as part of a wider campaign against tribal autonomy. Each deception was plausible. Each fed into pre-existing fears. All were timed to drive multiple factions toward Deer Creek at the same time. Meanwhile, Jonas manipulated the French. Through Henri Dubois, his primary contact among French traders, he fed Captain Taffanel intelligence about British movements. The information was accurate enough to trust, but incomplete in ways that pushed Taffanel to make reckless decisions. Believing British forces were massing elsewhere, Taffanel accelerated the convoy's journey and reduced its escort. Jonas also implied that nearby tribal groups were aligned with French interests, creating a false sense of security as the convoy moved into hostile territory. By November 20th, everything was in place. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson prepared to strike what they believed was a lightly defended target carrying critical supplies. Mohawk warriors were ready to protect what they thought was a peaceful mission. And Captain Taffanel, convinced he was avoiding danger, led his convoy straight into a trap. Jonas had aligned three forces, each operating on true but incomplete intelligence toward mutual annihilation. In the final days before the Deer Creek massacre, Jonas was electrified. He had composed a perfect storm, a collision of intentions, each actor following their own logic, their own duty, their own truth. None of them knew they were playing roles in a larger script written by an 11-year-old boy. On the night of November 22nd, as troops marched, wagons rolled, and warriors stalked through the forest, Jonas sat alone in the upper room of Fort Hunter, quietly preparing to witness the culmination of his grandest operation. Jonas Creighton positioned himself on a wooded ridge overlooking Deer Creek, far enough to remain unseen, close enough to witness the carnage he had engineered. As French scouts took up positions along the water's edge, the boy felt a rising thrill, an intoxicating, godlike satisfaction he would never again replicate. Tomorrow, the culmination of his grand design would unfold. It was the final proof that an 11-year-old armed with nothing but carefully constructed lies and precisely timed truths could control the fates of nations and lead seasoned warriors to their deaths. By late autumn, Jonas's appetite had evolved beyond profit. What had begun as calculated manipulation for financial gain had become something darker. He had discovered a deeper, more addictive power, the ability to decide who lived and who died, all through the quiet placement of information. The latest opportunity came in the form of a French supply convoy, led by Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel. 40 soldiers guarded a baggage train carrying vital winter provisions for scattered French forts. To British commanders, it was a legitimate military target. To Jonas, it was the perfect instrument for orchestrating the most devastating misunderstanding of his young, bloody career. Through his father's network, Jonas ensured British intelligence received word of the convoy. But the message was doctored. It described a lightly defended train escorted by only 20 men carrying a payroll chest worth thousands of pounds. To British officers, desperate for a morale-boosting victory, the bait was irresistible. Simultaneously, Jonas visited Karanhiaktati, a Mohawk war chief, with urgent news. The British were planning an unprovoked assault on what was in truth a peaceful trading mission. The convoy, he claimed, carried gifts and winter supplies meant for Mohawk families, compensation for past losses. If they didn't act, their people would starve. His third and most diabolical move involved the French. Through Henri Dubois, a trusted trader and conduit to French command, Jonas delivered intelligence suggesting that the British, backed by Oneida allies, planned a coordinated assault on Kaianhari, a Mohawk stronghold. The attack, he warned, would coincide with the convoy ambush. Though the convoy's mission was routine resupply, Jonas framed it as part of a larger war strategy, subtly implying that any tribal groups not acting now would soon be targets themselves. None of the intelligence Jonas shared was entirely false. That was his genius. The British were planning to intercept the convoy. Some commanders had discussed strikes on hostile territories. The French were moving troops in the region. By combining truth with distortion and timing, Jonas created a three-sided conflict in which every party believed they were acting defensively, when in fact they were all walking into a bloodbath. At dawn on November 23rd, it began. Deer Creek, 12 miles northwest of Fort Hunter, was quiet. The forest hushed beneath a rising mist. Taffanel's convoy had camped overnight on the eastern bank, unaware that two enemy forces were closing in. From the south, Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson led 60 colonial militiamen and 20 Oneida warriors, believing they would ambush a small French escort and seize a rich prize. From the west, Karanhiaktati's 43 Mohawk warriors moved to defend what they thought was a humanitarian expedition under imminent attack. At 6:30 a.m., a British scout spotted movement in the French camp and fired. That single shot shattered the morning stillness and triggered the Deer Creek massacre. What followed defied all conventions of 18th century warfare. French soldiers, trained and disciplined, rallied and returned fire. The British militia, realizing they were not facing a vulnerable patrol, but a full military unit, pressed forward in confusion and desperation. The Oneida warriors, caught between conflicting loyalties and bewildered by the presence of Mohawk fighters alongside the French, tried to protect their British allies without directly engaging their cousins. The Mohawk war party, seeing what they believed was a betrayal unfolding, flanked the British and opened fire, convinced they were defending their own. For 6 chaotic hours, former allies shot at each other across a battlefield. No one understood. Trust collapsed in minutes. Old friendships dissolved in musket smoke. The dead lay where they fell, killed not just by bullets, but by invisible forces of fear and manipulation. When the smoke cleared, the toll was staggering. 31 French soldiers were dead, including Captain Taffanel. 28 British troops were killed among them. Colonel Johnson. 17 Mohawk warriors died fighting for what they believed was justice. 9 Oneida warriors were caught in the crossfire, some dying, while protecting their British comrades, others struck by bullets from old allies turned enemies. But the true horror of Deer Creek wasn't the body count. It was the confusion that lingered. Survivors on every side told conflicting stories. French soldiers swore they'd been ambushed by British forces that somehow knew their exact location. British militiamen believed they had walked into a French trap. The Mohawks spoke of betrayal and treachery. The Oneida, grief-stricken and bewildered, wondered how a mission of protection had turned into slaughter. Back at Fort Hunter, Jonas Creighton sat alone in his father's study, recording the aftermath in calm, precise handwriting. 85 dead, 7 new weapon orders, totaling over 300 muskets. A sudden demand for armed escorts in future diplomatic missions. Supply requests from panicked tribal settlements. The massacre had produced not just corpses, but contracts. Each grave, each shattered alliance was a business opportunity. And Jonas, an 11-year-old boy with gray eyes and unshakable calm, had become the composer of it all. The Deer Creek massacre created chaos that even Jonas Creighton hadn't foreseen. With over 80 dead soldiers, warriors, civilians, the incident was too devastating to dismiss as a mere frontier skirmish. Governor George Clinton, alarmed by the scale and timing of the bloodshed, ordered a formal investigation. He dispatched Major Samuel Wells, a seasoned military officer with first-hand experience in European conflicts and a sharp understanding of the power of intelligence. His first question was simple. How had 3 distinct forces converged at the same location at the same time, all believing they were acting in self-defense? The answer led Wells to Fort Hunter and to the Creighton trading post, which had supplied weapons to all 3 factions. Hamish Creighton, anxious but unaware of his son's role, cooperated fully. He handed over sales records correspondence with British officers and detailed notes on his role as an intelligence informant. But Major Wells was methodical. He spotted irregularities, tiny variations, in reports passed between French-British and tribal leaders. Each discrepancy was subtle, yet unmistakably tailored, suggesting a single manipulative source with access to all sides. The investigation might have ended in bureaucratic ambiguity, if not for a chance moment on December 15th. During a routine interview with Mohawk leaders at Fort Hunter, Wells watched Jonas Creighton, seemingly just a translator, navigate a tense exchange between tribal elders and colonial officials. But Wells, fluent in Mohawk, noticed something chilling. Jonas wasn't just translating, he was managing the conversation. A complaint about food seizures became a theft accusation. A call for peace was subtly twisted into a demand for compensation. The boy altered intent without changing words. It was quiet, deliberate manipulation in real time. That evening, Wells requested a private interview with Jonas. The resulting conversation, preserved in his confidential report to Governor Clinton, was unlike anything he had encountered in his military career. Jonas spoke calmly, clinically. He explained how he had shaped the flow of intelligence across the region, not as acts of war, but as a business model. Information, he said, is like gunpowder. A little placed just right can move mountains. Too much all at once is just noise. He described how he planted rumors, how he adjusted translations to manipulate alliances, how he timed disclosures like a composer arranging notes in a symphony of bloodshed. To Jonas, casualties were metrics. Grieving families were indicators of increased demand. The Deer Creek Massacre, his most successful operation. Wells listened in growing horror. not just at the scale of Jonas's actions, but at the boy's complete lack of remorse. He had orchestrated the deaths of over 80 people and discussed it with the pride of a craftsman perfecting his trade. But the most disturbing revelation came at the end. Jonas hadn't acted out of greed or even to please his father. He had discovered something far more intoxicating, the raw power of manipulation. "I wanted to see if I could make them dance," Jonas admitted. "All of them. The British, the French, the Mohawk, the Oneida. I wanted to see if words could be stronger than armies." Faced with the truth, Major Wells was trapped. Prosecuting an 11-year-old for orchestrating a multi-front massacre would expose colonial security failures and intelligence vulnerabilities no one wanted revealed. Worse, Jonas's methods could be copied by others. Publishing the full report would be equivalent to handing future enemies a manual for weaponized information warfare. After consultation with Governor Clinton, the decision was made to bury the truth. Officially, the Deer Creek massacre was blamed on communication failures and fog of war. Jonas Creighton's role was sealed by gubernatorial order. Access was limited to senior military officials and colonial administrators. As for the boy himself, he couldn't be tried without exposure. But he couldn't be left free either. On January 12, 1746, records show that Jonas Creighton died of fever during a harsh winter outbreak. A small funeral was held at Fort Hunter, attended by his father and a few family friends. No grave marker was placed. The official story ended there. In reality, Jonas was quietly transferred to a secure facility in Virginia. Colonial authorities, unsure what to do with a child capable of military-grade psychological warfare, intended to keep him under observation. But Jonas had no intention of being contained. The last confirmed sighting of Jonas Creighton occurred on March 3, 1746, at a secure house outside Williamsburg. He had spent 2 months being interrogated by intelligence officers, desperate to understand how an 11-year-old boy had hijacked entire war fronts with nothing but language, timing, and fear. And then he vanished. No records exist of where he went. No sightings were verified. Only scattered legends remain. Some say he fled west, disappearing into the frontier under a new name. Others claim he was recruited by whom no one dares to say. But one truth remains indisputable. Jonas Creighton changed the course of frontier warfare, and he did it before his 12th birthday. Jonas Creighton had cooperated with every interview, offering detailed explanations of his methods and chillingly precise insights into the psychological weaknesses he'd exploited. But as the weeks passed, his handlers began to notice something unsettling. The boy had stopped answering questions and started asking them probing inquiries about his interviewers' families' duties and authority. It became clear to several officials that Jonas wasn't being studied. He was studying them. Then on the night of March 3, 1746, Jonas vanished. His room was found empty. No forced entry, no broken locks, no signs of struggle. Somehow the 11-year-old had bypassed guards, escaped secured rooms, and slipped through layers of colonial military protection without tripping a single alarm. The search was immediate and exhaustive. Militia units scoured forests and settlements across 3 colonies. But the boy who had turned lies into weapons had disappeared into the vast, unmapped wilderness of early America. Some believed he was assassinated, perhaps by French agents seeking vengeance for Deer Creek. Others suspected retribution from Mohawk warriors who had finally uncovered the truth about the role he played in their suffering. But darker theories began to circulate that Jonas hadn't been killed at all, that he had found new sponsors, Spanish spies, rogue traders, even hostile tribes eager to employ his devastating talents. But the most terrifying possibility, recorded privately by Major Samuel Wells, was this: Jonas Creighton had simply returned to the shadows to do what he did best. Orchestrating war without a weapon, causing death with nothing but words. The truth about Jonas remained buried for decades, sealed by gubernatorial order, hidden in locked archives, forgotten by design. But silence never holds forever. In 1823, 77 years after Deer Creek, a dying Mohawk elder named Karanhiaktati, the brother of the war chief killed in the massacre, made a deathbed confession. Methodist missionary Samuel Kirkland transcribed the account, which was sealed in church archives, until its quiet rediscovery in 1968. In it, the old man revealed a secret that had haunted him for most of his life. The truth about the boy who spoke like water and struck like lightning. A child who manipulated nations into war. A child who did not die. According to Karanhiaktati, tribal elders had long suspected someone had guided their people into needless conflict. But they hadn't discovered the source until years after Jonas's disappearance. His final words, recorded with obvious hesitation by Kirkland, sent a chill through modern historians. He did not die. I have seen his shadow in other wars. The evil that small hands can do does not die with the hands that did it. To this day, debate surrounds the boy's fate. Some dismiss him as a legend, a myth born of trauma and folklore. After all, could an 11-year-old truly vanish into the wild and survive? Others are less sure. Intelligence failures, unexplained massacres, and eerily timed confrontations between French, British, and tribal forces continued to surface in the decades following Jonas's disappearance. The most comprehensive analysis, a 1987 Columbia University study, identified 17 incidents between 1746 and 1763 that showed hallmarks of Jonas's tactics, modified intelligence, mistranslated phrases, and perfectly timed chaos. While no definitive evidence links Jonas to these events, the pattern is undeniable. Whether his techniques survived through others or he lived on to guide more massacres, the fingerprints are unmistakable. One thing is certain: the winter of 1745 changed everything. The rules of frontier warfare evolved. Intelligence became more dangerous than gunpowder. And the age of weaponized information began because one child had shown it was possible. Jonas Creighton didn't just vanish. He became a ghost in the American record. His legacy lingers in every mistranslation that sparks violence, every whisper that leads to war, every moment where the truth arrives too late to save lives. He proved that the deadliest enemy is often the one you never see coming, especially when he speaks your language, wears your colors, and claims to fight for your side. So what do you think? Could a child have truly masterminded such carnage from the shadows? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this dark story from America's haunted frontier sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell for future episodes, and share this tale with someone who loves hidden history, true crime, and the terrifying power of manipulation. In our next video, we'll explore another suppressed chapter, another buried truth, another face history tried to erase. Until then, stay curious and stay cautious. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.